We need to do something very, very fundamental to change this dynamic. In my view, the dynamism of the American economy, regardless of its fairness, regardless of its inequalities, regardless of its negative attributes, if you will, we reached the zenith of our dynamism as a country when immigration was virtually stopped in the 20s. And since that time, we have been in an environment where we have an aging population because birth rates are dropping, and therefore Social Security, which was a wonderful idea in the 30s, we found ourselves in the enviable position of having 14 to 16 workers supporting each retiree. In today's world, we find ourselves with 1.5 to 2 workers supporting each retiree, and that is not likely to get any better anytime soon. What do we do? What is the answer? Well, first of all, one of the things that everyone seems to acknowledge that we need in this country, and if you paid attention to the, at least, arguments for No Child Left Behind, which in my view has left the whole country behind, was that we wanted to promote a higher level of education and understanding in math and science. Well, if you're forcing your teachers to teach your students math and science to a degree where they have to pass certain standard level examinations, the ultimate result is that they are taking time away from those disciplines which are unrelated to math and science, and yet very much related to the vitality of the society in which we live. When prayer was outlawed in the schools, just to digress for a minute, I frankly thought that was a good idea. And the reason I thought it was a good idea is because my prayer may not be your prayer. Your prayer may not be the prayer of someone next door to you. And to try to homogenize prayer in the schools is antithetical to a state that prides itself on having a separation of church and state. But I had to ask myself then, what was the reason that we wanted prayer in the schools in the first place? Bringing religion into the schools in a country that prides itself on the separation of church and state did so, I think, for a very fundamental reason, and that is to bring into the educational process the values that religions bring forth: dispute resolution, ethics, morality, laws of behavior, how we treat our fellow human beings, the kinds of things that are not easily taught, but ought to be a fundamental part of our curriculum in our schools. And so, having taken prayer out, they didn't replace it with the building blocks that prayer should have brought into our schools. How do we live with each other? How do we resolve disputes without violence? How do we have a common denominator of ethical and moral behavior that enables us to reinstitute a feeling of trust, a feeling of honor, a feeling of pride in the fact that our system lends itself to a community of interest among disparate human beings who have extremely disparate points of view on what religion in and of itself should mean in their daily lives. Having left that out, we find ourselves in a society, in my view, that is deteriorating in terms of its cohesiveness. exponentially. It's deteriorating because the common denominators that ought to bind us together are not being taught. And the things that are being taught not for our national interest, but for national security interests. So, as you may recall, the title of my lecture today was How Can the United States Compete in a World of Cheap Labor, Job Exportation, a Significant Trade Deficit, and the Rapidly Expanding Economies of the BRIC countries? Brazil, Russia, China, and India. And I think the answer to that is relatively simple. The fact is we need to have an employment agency immigration policy. If we need engineers, we should open our doors to any engineer who is vettable as a non-threatening combatant to come into this country and be a citizen of this country. If we need scientists, we should open our doors to any scientist anywhere in the world who wishes to bring his family, his talents, and his abilities to the United States. If we need laborers, then we should be willing to step up to the plate and say, those laborers that are here that are undocumented need to be documented. We need to bring them into the tax-paying system. We have an underground economy. I'm sure that all of you know, at least hypothetically, that there are tens of thousands of immigrants in this country who have immigrated illegally, who are not on the tax rolls, who have all of the benefits that our society affords, and yet do not contribute, not simply for a lack of desire to do so, quite to the contrary. But the fact is, once they contribute, they have identified themselves as being subject to deportation, totally antithetical to what our goals should be in terms of being an inclusive society that takes advantage of the skills that everyone brings to the table, and as a consequence also requires that they pay their fair share of the costs of our doing business.